Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming, guys. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching us on YouTube, on Rumble, on X, and on Facebook. The onslaught of the Israeli occupation forces continues on the Gaza Strip, and recently we have seen horrendous crimes in Rafah, which is technically called a safe zone for the Palestinians, and the Israeli side asked for the Palestinians to go to this area and said this is a safe zone. And however, we have seen new massacres committed and people were burned alive under the tents. And also, we watched video of a decapitated baby in Gaza. We are speaking about today. We're going to discuss what's happening in Gaza and also the dangerous situation in Ukraine and in Europe in general with Dr. Tarik Cyril Amar. He's a historian and assistant professor at Koch University. Thank you so much, Tarik, for coming again to Syriana Analysis. It's always a pleasure to listen to your insights.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Guys, it goes without saying that all the links of Tarik, his X account, his Substack, and his new podcast are in the description below. You can check them. All the links are there. Tarik, the Israeli occupation forces committed 2 massacres in the past 48 hours in the refugee camps in Rafah, designated as safe zones by the Israelis themselves. These massacres have massively changed, public opinion. Today, I was checking my Instagram account, and to be honest with you, for the first time, I see everyone in my feed speaking about what's happening in Rafah. All eyes are on Rafah. Also, politically speaking, in different governments, the public opinion around the world are shifting against Israel, and shifted dramatically, I would argue. And also, an increasing number of countries are recognizing the state of Palestine. But Germany is still struggling to join the global majority. I watched a video of Kevork. I think this was from Sunday, and she was in an event about democracy. And she was confronted by the protesters there, German protesters, against her so-called feminist foreign policy. And Kevork pushed back against the allegations that Germany is assisting Israel in its ongoing onslaught against the Palestinians by saying that she watched the video filmed by Hamas, GoPro of Hamas, raping Israeli women on October 7. Many people are asking me this question: why can't Germany see through what's happening in the Gaza Strip? What is wrong with the politicians? Is it about the only historical guilt, or they have other obligations in their minds, and they're committed to the security of Israel to the extent that one German politician told me, this was at the beginning of the onslaught on Gaza, this was in November 2023, he told me that, and this official, by the way, this politician is from a governing party in Germany, in the coalition. He said, even if Israel is committing a genocide, we are obliged to side on the side of Israel.
I'm speechless, but at the same time, I'm not surprised. It's the thing that leaves me speechless in what you've just said is how open this particular politician was about it, that he would makes this explicit to you, obviously thinking that you didn't have a wire and you wouldn't be able to tape him, but that he even dared actually say that is amazing, because for one thing, he or she, whoever it was, at this moment, they I think made themselves a suspect of being involved in a crime. Because being an accomplice in a genocide, I have to repeat it again, the Genocide Convention, which is the source here, 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention, is absolutely clear. Being an accomplice in a genocide is as criminal as perpetrating one. It's explicit, right? So if a politician says to you that even if it's a genocide, we would still side with them, he's saying, I would become a criminal in that case, because he's saying I would side with a crime. That's the definition of being an accomplice, right? And I think one issue with German politicians, and I do think with a lot of people also in German media, is that they are not aware how close they are to literal criminality. For instance, another thing that can also be treated as a crime under law, and we have a precedent for this, actually from the Rwanda genocide, is incitement of
Mm.
genocide. Incitement. There was somebody, one person, was convicted after the Rwanda genocide, happened to be a singer-songwriter, but he wasn't convicted for his songs. He was convicted for one inciting speech, and rightly so, because he gave that speech in the context of an ongoing genocide and was very clear that by the speech he literally incited people to kill, right? It's a very clear case, but incitement to genocide is also a criminal offense under international law. Now, I've started with the legal aspects, but of course there's also basic morality, right?
Oops.
I have to say, somebody who tells you to your face that even if X, I don't care who, even
Yes.
if X is committing mass murder, which genocide is, I would still side with X. I would have a very hard time not to hit that person.
Mm.
And I think he deserves that. Or I wouldn't hit a woman. I'm very old-fashioned. But I mean, this is an incredibly self-incriminating and self-revealing, disgusting statement. If you ever meet that person again, tell them from me. I despise them. I absolutely despise them. Now, the other thing is, I think one factor in the initial question, in the answer to the initial question you asked, which is, why is the German government, why is the German elite, not Germans in general, I think it's a different story, but the German government is so reluctant to finally change course? I think one reason is because they are so implicated already. This is the 8 months of this slaughter, and they have supported it. Germany is, again, many of your viewers and listeners know this already, but I repeat this, after the United States, Germany is the second largest arms and ammunitions importer to Israel. And while the genocide was ongoing, Germany ramped up its military supplies to Israel during the ongoing genocide, according to some counts, by as much as 10 times.
10 times. Yes, that's true.
Yes. So think about it. You have the German foreign minister, you have the German minister of defense, you have the chancellor, you have the German minister of economics, you have others in the cabinet, and you have an institution called the Bundessicherheitsrat, which is Federal Security Council. All these people were implicated in these decisions, one way or the other. Plus, from there it goes down to various high and low bureaucrats, civil servants. I mean, these people by now, after what the ICG has found, after what the ICC has finally done, as little as it is, we can talk about this as well, it's far too little, but if they don't understand that they are really in danger of being criminally prosecuted as well at some point in the future, and they can be prosecuted by international courts, or if the situation in Germany should change, they could be prosecuted by German courts, by the way, which they don't entirely control. I think some of them are beginning to understand that. So in a way, they are now in a dead end. They have trapped themselves. They are already complicit. Or, let me formulate this very, very carefully, right? I think a very powerful case for complicity and genocide against them can already be made. Already, it's too late. They can't go back from this. Look at somebody like Robert Habeck, right? Habeck now is coming out and saying, oh, Israel is breaching international law. Israel is crossing red lines. This is the same guy who, at the beginning of this slaughter, when a lot of people already were seeing clearly what was going on for good reasons, was saying, oh, no, it's German reason of state, Staatsräson, that we have to go with Israel, and Israel is fine. I remember how he said, he literally argued months ago that, yeah, you can sort of be a little critical of how the Israelis conduct their war. That he would concede, right? You can criticize that a little bit. But no genocide, no crimes against humanity. He was adamant about this. Yes. And that means all of this time, he has made decisions as well according to that line. And all of these decisions are on record. So he can come out now and say, oh, I think the Israelis are wrong after all. That doesn't save him from what he's already done. So for these German politicians who are implicated in Israeli crimes, it has become extremely difficult to find their way out. Extremely difficult. There are other factors, I think psychological factors, historical factors. Look, we've talked about this before. There is this whole complacent, I'm German, right? And I'm going to say there is this complacent, disgusting, perverse self-indulgence in which German elites have found a comfort in basically saying our grandpa and grandma committed a genocide in Europe against Jews, and that's why we now have a special privilege of letting a genocide pass and even help in it as long as it's committed by Israel. This is the core of the mental perversion that we are seeing here. It's a form of complacency. Now, the obviously, to the correct response, the correct ethical response, the correct response to learning from the Holocaust, for Germans as well, they don't get special privileges here, especially not Germans, would be to acknowledge that genocide must not be committed by anybody against anybody, period.
Yes.
There are no exceptions, right? But they don't want to accept that. They actually think that, oh, if it's Israel, first of all, we don't want to acknowledge it. Or like the guy who talked to you or that person who talked to you, they know it, but they still don't want to say it. And secondly, they think they get a free pass on actually tolerating it and helping it.
That's so
God.
true.
I mean, it is revolting.
You know, Tarek, you speak and you also speak for me. I mean, I have similar feelings, but I have really, since the Syrian war and all the, in my opinion, the injustices inflicted on the Syrian people and all the support that the CIA, the Pentagon, the Western intelligence agencies have given to these very radical groups in Syria who heads were hanged in the streets, right? And it infuriated me, of course. And now what's happening in Gaza does the same thing. And the other day, this was a few weeks ago, I saw Baerbock in the Bundestag, and like she passed like 1 meter away from me, and all these memories, like I know, like if I open my mouth, then I know what I'm going to speak. So I truly try to suppress my emotional and hormonal, let's say, sentiments, because what these people are doing, they only deserve to be called out, at least the least to say. And even if they leave their position of power, they're not going. This what happened during this time. It's not going to be erased.
Kevork, if I may, you're absolutely right. But if I may say one more thing, which I forgot, and I think it should be said. Look, this response by Baerbock, as you've mentioned her, right? She's challenged about Israel committing these horrific crimes that range from a spectrum, right? You have war crimes, you have crimes against humanity, you have genocide, and in there's also ethnic cleansing, right? All of it. It's a catalog of crimes that they're committing relentlessly. So she's challenged about this, and her response is, well, I have seen videos of women being raped by Hamas. Okay, right? So there are two things that are remarkable about this. Two. First of all, she obviously thinks that if Hamas has raped women, then Israel is allowed to commit genocide. That is an astonishing construction in and of itself, but that's obviously what she thinks. She thinks the answer to Israel is committing genocide is to say, yes, but Hamas committed crimes. Now, you are never allowed to commit genocide under no circumstances. She hasn't even understood that. There is no sort of retaliation right. Now, that's point number one. Point number two, of course, at least equally important, is what videos. What she has told us is that she's seen these videos in Israel. We know that Israel is incredibly proficient in lying, in propaganda, in disinformation, and what they call hasbara. And quite rightly, Ali Abu Nima, as you probably know from the Electronic Intifada, has asked a very simple question. Where are those videos? Show us those videos at least. So here's my guess. First of all, she was watching Israeli fakes. That's what she did. And she chose to believe them. If she ever watched anything, let's assume she did watch something. She's not just hallucinating or lying, which is the third possibility. Let's assume she watched something. Then my guess is she watched Israeli fakes and she chose to believe them. And then the third point is to come back to the initial point, even if, for the sake of argument, as it were, this one video were authentic, it does not somehow create an Israeli right to commit genocide.
Yes.
And she doesn't even understand that. She doesn't understand a thing.
And this is one of the commentators says Westerners have raped women in Iraq. Does this mean Iraqis also get to commit genocide in countries which invaded them?
The Israelis themselves are committing massive sexual violence against men and women. We know this about Israel, and not just in this campaign, if that's the word. They have a system of committing sexual violence against Palestinians because, first of all, there are a lot of sadists there. Let's say there are a lot of sick Israeli sadists who apparently get a kick out of this stuff. But then, of course, there also is a deliberate politics of doing this. There is a strategy of doing this because, and human rights organizations have written about this, because the idea is that in Palestinian society, as in many societies, if you humiliate and break people with sexual violence, you inflict particularly severe pain and disruption on them and on their society. The Israelis have a record of sexual violence. They do. But of course, Annalena Baerbock, the feminist, doesn't care to know about that, right? Does she?
Tarik,
I've so had it with this person.
Yeah,
it's just she is disgrace.
What depresses me the most, like, for example, tweets like this comes from the foreign ministry of Germany. They say the images of charred bodies, including children from airstrikes in Rafah, are unbearable. The exact circumstances must be clarified, and an IDF investigation launched swiftly. The civilian population in Gaza must urgently be better protected. Like, you see this 2.1 million views, and it's all coming because of the comments. You have to go and read the comments. It's incredible what the people are doing with this tweet. And you know why I'm asking this question? I say I'm also depressed because last week, for example, and I live in Germany, you know that the German mainstream media reacted hysterically to a video posted by some drunk young Germans singing a song that says Foreigners out, Germany for Germans, Ausländer raus, Deutschland für die Deutsche. And when I see this, how they reacted to some drunk kids, I'm myself, I'm an Ausländer, right? And I didn't feel any offended or threatened by this video. I was laughing when I watched the video, and the song started clinging in my head. You know, like I'm walking in the street, and like da, 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 da. It's like, what the fuck? You know, it's like, it's not even offensive. It just feel like. For me, at least, okay, so what? You some drunk guys, you're singing some offensive song. Okay, so what? And this is happening in Germany, while minimum to no mention at all by the same mainstream journalists to the daily massacres in Gaza. I mean, a German journalist published an article a few weeks ago titled, quote, "There are no innocent civilians in Gaza," without any backlash or outrage from this establishment journalists, right? So what does this tells us about the state of affairs in the German mainstream press? Like, I'm specifically asking about these journalists who work for these TV channels, for these newspapers, and they don't cover these cases in the way that it deserve to be covered, or not at all. Somebody comes and says there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. Check, nothing happens. And some drunk people singing foreigners out, they all lose their jobs, and now they criminalize the song. The song, which is by, I think it's French song, but they just added some.
I don't know either. It's, you know, but French or Italian or something. And the guy who made the song has come out and said, you know, I have nothing to do with these messages. They're superimposed on my melody, and so on and so on. But look, I mean, my father was an Ausländer. That's how I got my name, right? and I have always lived in this slightly, I don't know if funny is the word, funny situation in Germany, where I look, for all intents and purposes, very German, right? So I look a way that people don't recognize a half Ausländer in me, right? But I have the name, that's a giveaway. And so I'm a very peculiar situation. And to me, it has never been very hurtful at all, but I've been privileged in a way, right? But having said that about where I come from myself, look, some drunken, let me be open here, some drunken Arschlöcher, right? In some bar in Sylt, of all places. I'm a socialist. Tell me about a bar in Sylt, and I'm already angry, right? So some drunken assholes in a bar in Sylt. I have no sympathy for them. To be honest, if they lose their job, well, there you go,
Mm.
But I think you're absolutely right that there is an incredible disproportion between the brouhaha about that, bad as it is, and the way in which German media, German cultural representatives, German politicians have treated an ongoing genocide in which Germany is involved, actually, right? So that should be a much, much bigger issue. And to be honest, I have to say to you, I think the perverse thing here is that going after the few idiots on Sylt, right? Okay, they can get what they deserve. I don't care. But it's an Ersatzhandlung. It's a substitute, right? They go after these guys. They give themselves a good conscience because by going after these drunken assholes, we are showing ourselves that we are not racists. Those are the racists, the drunken idiots on Sylt, right? But at the same time, when you look at the way that Germany, the elites, the cultural elites, the political elites, the media elites, as a whole, how they have treated the Gaza genocide, that is one of the most racist things I've ever seen. Because one of the explanations for this, without you can't explain it, is that the Palestinians do not matter to these people the same way that Germans would. They do not matter to them. The way in which this cold-blooded, arrogant, oh my God, yeah, that's bad, but yeah, what can you do?
I watched the
Let the
video.
IDF, or let the IDF investigate itself. Or remember how this started. At the beginning, it was even worse when a lot of Germans got a kick out of even doubting the facts of what was happening to the Palestinians. Remember how they said when Palestinian babies were killed at the beginning, oh, those are our dolls. They come from Asia, Asian-made dolls, I mean, what's that for racist discourse again? Remember the term Pallywood? How they implied that Palestinians somehow play acted, right? They play acted their suffering.
Yes.
There is an enormous racism in Germany. And you can see it in the way they treat the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So if the same people then go after a few drunks in Sylt and think they therefore are these wonderful shining fighters against racism, once again, they have my deepest, most heartfelt contempt. Absolute contempt. Damn hypocrites.
Tarek, this type of behavior, it's also coming from, of course, there is racism. I totally agree with you, but there is incredible level of incompetence nowadays among European politicians. And this is where I want to go with the discussion with you. For example, I watched 2 videos of Kaya Kallas, and we are going, and it's the same reaction that I do every time I watch her videos. The first one, she says, Ukraine must win the war, and Russia must understand that it has lost. This is our plan A, B, and C. Words and sanctions are important, but they are not enough. Ukraine needs weapons, ammunition, and training. It also needs financial and economic support, and it needs it now. Our role and duty are not only to continue, but to strengthen our support for Ukraine on all fronts. The second one, which is the most important one, she says that Russia's defeat is not so bad. There are many nations that are part of Russia. If they were more small states, it wouldn't be such a bad thing if the big power became much smaller. And why I say incompetence? Because she has given a big service to Russia by this statement. Because what Russia claims always, that if Ukraine becomes not NATO, then the United States will have the capacity to project its hegemony inside of Russia and try to destabilize Russia from within and balkanize the Russian Federation. So what she's basically saying, what they speak in the behind doors, she just said it. This is why I say the incompetence, right, of these politicians. And it's dangerous also that we have this type of politicians in a position of power and leading all this madness against Russia instead of cooperating with Russia.
Yeah. I mean, look what you've described, right? These two Kaya Kallas performances. One is about being delusional, right? The whole idea that Russia is actually losing the war, and by implication, the West and Ukraine, we are winning. It's delusional, right? It's really, it just doesn't sync with reality at all, right? So that's one thing, and that's bad enough. But the second incident, the second performance, where she talks about breaking up Russia or Russia breaking up
Yes.
itself somehow, right? First of all, you're absolutely right. She is confirming to the Russians what they have been thinking this since the first war in Chechnya. Since the mid-90s, the Russians have been thinking this. And look, here's the problem. Between states, because states use so much underhanded tricks against each other, and they use so much secret service stuff and covert operations and all that bullshit, and the Russians do it too, of course. But between states, there can easily emerge sort of a climate of paranoia. But the Russians, when they started thinking that there were people in the West, including in the United States and including in higher office, who thought that the fragmentation of the Soviet Union wasn't good enough, that the Russian Federation itself should also fall apart, and that the West should help that process along, the Russians had some basis in fact. There were such people, and there are such people in the West. The Russians have a point, unfortunately. We have such mad people, and some of them are even in positions of influence. They should be marginal types, but not all of them are, definitely not. So when somebody like Kaja Kallas comes out and says this quiet part out loud, yeah, she's confirming all of these Russian concerns. And I repeat once again, while some of them may be exaggerated, there is a core of truth to these concerns. We in the West have such people. We shouldn't. Now, the other thing, of course, is that you see what the problem with NATO is, and beyond NATO, with the collective West, also with the EU, to an extent, you could even say with the G7. The problem is that we have no self-discipline mechanisms anymore. That is, in NATO, the most extreme, the most unhinged types and voices can do what they want. Let me put it like this. When NATO expanded to the east, which I have come to understand was a huge mistake. It's true, it was a big mistake. When NATO expanded to the east, it took in the Kaja Kallas types or Gabrielus Landsbergis, these guys, right? People who dream that coming from small states with actually very small armies, Lithuania and Estonia, they can wag the NATO dog. They can somehow leverage their position in NATO to make all of NATO do their extremist bidding, which is actually trying to somehow, in the end, take on Russia, right? Now, if NATO was a more rational organization, then two things could happen at this point. Either it would have an expulsion mechanism, and we would say to these types, you know what? You want to go to war with Russia? Is that what you want? Then please leave NATO. You can do that on your own. We won't help, right? But we don't have an expulsion mechanism. And of course, there are people in America who like this stuff. And America calls the shots. The second thing that a more self-disciplined, more reasonable NATO, which doesn't exist, would have is sort of a center and a core and a leadership that would actually come out and loudly set these people aside and say, no, they're not speaking for us. But the situation in NATO is everybody who wants to do radical shit, I'm sorry to put it brutally, can do it. Everybody, it's a free-for-all. Obviously, inside there's still mechanisms where a Kaja Kallas will not get, immediate full American support. I understand that. Luckily, the extremists don't always get everything they want. But the problem in NATO is that we have no way, and I think a lot of people in NATO don't want the way. The Americans don't want it. People like Blinken don't want it. The neocons don't want it. People like Stoltenberg don't want it. We have no way in NATO of defining a moderate, reasonable NATO position so that the extremists can constantly try to shift the NATO position. Now, Russia looks at that from outside and sees that this is happening. And so when then somebody like Stoltenberg on a good day goes to Russia and says, look, we are predictable, we are rational, why do you feel threatened by us? The response from Russia is they're laughing them off and they're saying, we feel threatened by you because you're full of madmen and you're not controlling them. So what does this tell us about you?
Tarik, you mentioning all these things, and now it comes this article today in front of me. It says the Baltic countries are telling Germany and the NATO countries that members of parliament for the Baltic states warned German officials last week that their governments are poised to send troops to Ukraine if Russia achieves considerable gains. Der Spiegel reported. The German outlet reported on Sunday that the Baltic officials issued the warning while
Yes.
speaking with representatives for Berlin at the Lennart Meri conference in Tallinn.
Yes.
Der Spiegel neither named any of the officials nor identified which countries they represented, but reported that they raised concern about Chancellor Olaf Scholz's current policy toward the war.
There you have it. It's basically extremists blackmailing Scholz, who's not a good politician, don't get me wrong. But within this NATO circus, Scholz, for reasons of his own, which are opportunistic, is sort of a moderate, right? And so this is the extremists blackmailing a moderate and saying, look, if you don't move along, if you don't want to confront Russia even more, we are going to do it. And by that, we are going to drag you into this. But the problem is, and this is, by the way, I think the same conference where Kaja Kallas made those insane remarks. It's also, I think, a conference where Tim Snyder gave a little speech, which is very appropriate. But look, the problem is, if Estonian officials or any Baltic officials approach the Germans and say this, the normal response would be, you know what? We were planning to send a brigade to be stationed there, which they are, right? Forget the brigade. If you want to blackmail us to become more exposed than we want to be, we don't need to work with you. But it's the other way around. In NATO, there is now a tendency constantly where the most radical elements drive the other ones, And the less radical elements, to put it very, very sort of neutrally, are always on the defensive. And look at the way that the participation, the de facto NATO participation in the war has developed. At the beginning, it was no lethal aid, no tanks, no BMPs, no F-16, no this rocket, no that rocket. They have all been delivered by now. And now we are at the stage where Stoltenberg has just, as you know, made another push together with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, right, to force the rest of the NATO members to allow the Ukrainians to use weapons that they have supplied to strike on pre-war Russian territory. Everybody agrees this is a major escalation, but once again, the most radical faction inside NATO is driving the agenda. And this happens again and again and again and again. And I think one of the reasons is that NATO is now a victim of this new McCarthyism, as weird as this sounds, right? Because they helped construct it. But they've created such a climate in the West that everybody who hesitates for a second to go along with the new, most radical, most insane idea against Russia immediately looks like a traitor. Yes. So right now we are in this insane narrative game where when somebody ups the ante again, you cannot be seen to resist. I mean, Scholz is trying sometimes because he's afraid. First of all, he usually at some point, tilts over. But the other thing is he has very little to stand on because inside the West, more broadly speaking, not just NATO, there is no faction anymore that says we also want to defend the West, we also want security, maybe even we also don't like the Russians, right? But we want to do it rationally. We don't want to overdo it. We want to be cautious. This whole position has been totally discredited. And right now, it's only the extremists who have credibility, which is horrible, pathological.
Tarik, when you are a politician and you pursue the national interests of your country, and this is based on the pros and cons and calculations and what is possible and what is not possible, and are you able to score political points after military operation, you have to see if you're capable of inflicting pain on your enemy or not, and how could be the reaction of your enemy against you. There are sort of calculations before taking a position. The problem that I see in these politicians that it comes from a position of what we say Russophobia. It's like we hate the Russians, we hate the Russians, so they hate the sentiments. When you add the sentiments into policy making, it becomes irrational.
That's very
irrational
clear.
policy.
I mean, if you look at people,
No, that's it. I mean, that's why when I see people like Kallas and people like Baerbock, I truly feel like more sentiments than rational policy, you know?
I think you're absolutely right about this. One part is this emotional, really hatred toward Russians, which is very interesting, is perhaps not the right word, but it's intriguing to see, because you might find this surprising, but in the early 2000s, I remember very well, in the early 2000s, when Putin was still new, right? There were a lot of Germans who really romanticized him, who loved him, right? And I remember some of the people who are now like total Russia haters trying to explain to me then that I was being too skeptical about him. Literally. And so we have in Germany especially, it's really weird. It's a love-hate relationship, literally. It's either love or it's hate, right? And what seems to be very hard to achieve is a reasonable, cooperative, maybe even skeptical attitude that would allow us to understand they have their interests, they have their way of doing things, they have their sovereignty. We don't need to modernize them. We don't need to change them. That's not our job. We can trade with them. We also don't want them to change us. That would be sort of an adult relationship with Russia, and Germans as a whole, I'm sorry, can't find it. They're either romanticizing it, which they had a cycle of that recently, and now they hate each other for that, and they're sort of, confessing their sins about that, or they lapse into this insane hatred.
Yeah.
Of course, you find it as well in other parts of Europe. You find it in Eastern Europe. You have to be fair with some Eastern European societies. In history, there are reasons why they have a very difficult relationship with Russia. That still doesn't give them the right to drive everybody else into World War III. I'll be very clear here. I have a reasonable understanding of Polish history, of Baltic history, and I understand that historically speaking, there were very difficult relationships with the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, right? But I'm sorry, even though you don't get a right to try to take apart the Russian Federation, because that's a major danger to world peace, and we don't want that. And secondly, you don't get a right to try to mobilize NATO for your private crusade to sort of retaliate for the past. This shouldn't wash. But there's something else that's happening, which is it's not only a very emotional relationship with Russia. In Germany, at least, there's now a very emotional relationship with Ukraine, which is really strange, especially for somebody like me who's lived in Ukraine for 5 years. And I speak not only Russian, I speak Ukrainian. If anything, my Ukrainian is even a little better than my Russian, right? I learned it in Lviv. I mean, what can I say?
Oh my God.
So I have had an intense relationship with Ukraine for many years before these guys even know it existed, right?
Yeah.
And now I see this insane love affair where Robert Habeck speaks to a German audience and says, I've been to Ukraine and I've talked to Zelensky. And Habeck literally says to these Germans, and Zelensky, he's almost begging me, he's virtually begging me. And he's saying to me, he's Zelensky to Habeck, he's saying to me, you are the Germans. Why are you not helping us? And all that this little thing tells me is that Habeck has a pathologically emotional relationship with Ukraine, where he has adopted this role of this big protector, right? That Zelensky, he uses this term, is begging to. And he, as the big German giant, must protect him now. This is all sickening. This is not rational policy. It is exactly what you say. It is highly emotionalized, and these people are on these weird psychological trips that gives them kicks. Now, the other thing, one last point, I know I'm going on, but one last point. They are not helping Ukraine either. One reason why I hate Western policy so much by now is that I'm actually a friend of Ukraine because I've lived there for 5 years. I used to know a lot of Ukrainians. I'm sure a lot of them misunderstand what I'm saying now and they don't like me anymore. Bad luck. But I actually have an intense relationship with Ukrainians. And I didn't want to see them used up in this proxy war in this way. And all these new friends of Ukraine who are so proud of this paraded friendship, that's what they're doing. They are using up the Ukrainians in a proxy war for the West.
Before I comment on this last part of your comment about Habeck and this trying to add emotions and sensations into it. We are now watching around 900 people live between X, YouTube, and Facebook and Rumble. So, guys, if you joined later on this live streaming, all the relevant links of Tarek, his podcast, his Substack, and his X are in the description below. Since you mentioned how Habek spoke about Zelensky, and I tried to draw parallels in my brain with what happened in Damascus when ISIS was in the
Mm,
Yarmouk camp. They were a few kilometers away from the presidential palace
mm,
when they called the Russians. Imagine
mhm.
if the Russians came, if Putin came to his people and said same thing like Habek said, these poor Syrians, ISIS is 2 kilometers away from the presidential palace, and try to add emotions to the discussion that we have to go and help Bashar because these invaders are going. It's like, what do they think before coming out and giving a statement and trying to convince your own people, like the Germans, that we have to get involved in this, right? We
I
have
can tell
to.
you what they think. I have a guess. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think that somebody like Habeck, insofar as he thinks while saying something like this, believes that this type of language, this type of rhetoric will resonate well with a lot of German voters. And very unfortunately, I think he may be right about that. So my worst suspicion is that when we see people like Baerbock and Habeck using this very cheap, emotionalizing rhetoric, right, that in the end leads to catastrophes for the Ukrainians, actually, that it still works with a lot of Germans in the German public. And I wished it wasn't. It's time to wake up. The policy that the West has conducted has not benefited Ukraine. It has
Mm,
devastated Ukraine. It has
indeed.
devastated Ukraine. And this whole talk that was so fashionable like a year or two ago about, oh, they must have their agency, they must have their agency. The agency that we accorded to them was to join us and be our proxies. That's the agency we accorded to Ukraine. And by now, hundreds of thousands are dead for that. It would have been better and more ethical, and I'll say it clearly, if we in the West had said, no, this is not your choice. You will not have the option of entering NATO. We are doing you a favor because by not giving you this option, we are not giving you the possibility of ending up in a devastating war. But we did the opposite. We did the opposite. We literally baited them into this, and they got devastated.
Tarek, you're coming from a rational position. I mean, I know there is another politician that you like her a lot. Just being sarcastic, Ursula von der Leyen. And Ursula says, in my second mandate, I want to turbocharge our defense industrial capacity, launch common defense projects like exploring a European air defense shield and better prepared against all threats, including cyber. So she is participating in the elections. They're not going to back off. So, and this is the topic
No,
of today's. When I titled it like, "Is the United States going into war against China and Russia at the same time?" Because this is just my opinion. Please disagree with me if you do. Um, my opinion is that now the Americans come to the conclusion that they cannot score a decisive victory against Russia in Ukraine,
yeah,
and China is more important
yes,
as a bigger threat to the United States from their perspective. So they have to pivot to the Pacific, to the Asia, to the
mhm,
Taiwan Strait.
yeah,
And what they do basically, they want to give this mission to the Europeans. So now we have people
yes,
like Ursula von der Leyen. They are increasingly speaking about the
yes,
militarization of Europe. We have Rishi Sunak says that we have to reintroduce the military service for the 18 years old. Oh, we will give you better jobs in the future if you go to the military, which means like you're already probably going to die if you are in war against Russia, because this is not like a World War II only armies fighting against each other. We are in a very, very, very dangerous era. We are speaking
yeah,
about tactical nukes. We are speaking about hypersonic missiles.
mhm.
Do you see that there is this now the attempt by the collective West that the United States has to focus on China? And then the Europeans have to accelerate their military production and militarize their societies to fill this vacuum when the Americans withdraw from the Ukraine case, or lead it from the behind, as they say. And then the Europeans take the lead in Ukraine, and then the Americans take the lead in against China.
Yeah, look, first of all, I think you're right. I think the picture is not yet very clear, but I think there is this tendency. We've seen it now for a while. When the United States came to finally understand that they couldn't win the war in Vietnam, right, at sort of end of the 60s, 1970, what they started was a conscious policy that they called Vietnamization, right? And what they meant by that is we are going to get out. While we are getting out, we are also devastating North Vietnam even more with bombing, and we'll also destroy Cambodia while we're at it, and Laos, right? But we are getting out in our very destructive way, and we leave the war to the Vietnamese alone, right? That was the tactic of Vietnamization, and they did it. I have often thought that there are now signs of Americans pursuing a strategy of Europeanization of this war, where they're handing this over successively to the European members of NATO, plus maybe Canada can play a role, and Japan from afar, stuff like that. South Korea can supply some stuff. Plus, of course, then also the EU, which is now totally subordinated to NATO. By the way, I don't see Ursula von der Leyen as a German or European politician. I think she's literally an American consul right now. That's what she is. That's her real role. I see her as an American consul in Europe, and it's a shame that we tolerate this. But back to the problem of Europeanization, this takes very concrete forms, right? You have this idea that Stoltenberg has this idea. He originally called it Mission for Ukraine, but they're changing the name now because the name wasn't very fortunately chosen.
Yes.
They noticed after he came out with it. But the idea is the same. The idea is to get together 100 billion euros from somewhere, somehow, and use this, but not from the US, and use this to long-term finance a long-term war in Ukraine. And this is basically Europeanizing, right? And this goes together with something else which we should mention, which is the idea of Trump proving, right? Because we have a little event coming up in early November, which is American elections. And right now, it looks as if Trump is likely to win. We don't know. Maybe Biden pulls something off. Maybe something happens to Trump. I don't think anything can be excluded anymore in our great Western value world. Or maybe the Democrats at the last minute actually show us a surprise Democrat like Michelle Obama or something instead of Biden, and upset all calculations. But right now, there is a serious concern among many that Trump will actually win. And I think I can't stand Trump. I think concerning Israel, Middle East, he's as much the devil as all of them. And he has many, many other very dark sides that I hate. But I do think that one thing is probably real about him. His often announced idea that he would shut down the war in Ukraine. Partly this has to do with the fact that Trump also wants to be much more confrontational with China again, right? So this is that factor. So there are these tendencies of finding ways on one side to shift the weight of the war to Europe, the financing of the war to Europe, and which Europe has already done a lot of financing of this war, actually, a little more than the Americans, if you take it together, and to also create a situation in which a policy change in the United States somehow magically isn't capable anymore of ending this war. I think this won't succeed. If Trump becomes president and he really wants to shut down the war, he will be able to shut down the war, whatever they do in terms of Trump proving in advance. But unfortunately, these games are being played now. And there's one more thing that worries me a lot, which is not even only about the war in Ukraine as it is ongoing right now. If you read Spiegel, for instance, if you read you mentioned Britain, Sweden, similar tendencies, we can see it all across Europe. There is this new idea that all of Europe has to be militarized. And they always
Yes.
use a very similar phrase. I think they get the same memo, which is all society approach. German generals use it, British generals use it, it's all the same phrase. Bauer has used it from NATO, who's a Dutch admiral. They're all on this, all society approach. And what they're literally telling us is they want to militarize all of Europe in a permanent posture against Russia. And
Yes.
I mean, the guy who's most responsible for this in the Bundeswehr, I think it's somebody called Bodemann or something. And there's been a long interview with him in Spiegel right now. And it's astonishing what this guy says, because at one point he says, look, the German constitution only knows war, basically, Verteidigungsfall, war,
Yeah.
peace, and then in between there's something like Spannungsfall.
Mm.
And then he says, we are not in any of these. We are in a fourth situation.
Mm.
Now, nobody at Spiegel does journalism anymore, because if they had journalists, they would have interrupted him and said to him, wait a minute, are you saying you're proceeding on the assumption that you are doing something that the Grundgesetz, the constitution, hasn't foreseen? You, a general, or your whole planning is based on some fantasy that is explicitly not in the German constitution, right? So this is just one of these little tidbits from this world in which we are all being invited to militarize our minds, to militarize our economies. At the same time, Europe's demography is worse than we thought. It's actually even worse. We've had a recent study coming out. It's worse than we thought. Its economy is, of course, in the doldrums. Where is this supposed to go? How is this supposed to work? You're going to run an impoverished garrison state? This is your future of the EU?
Tarek, when you give all this analysis and we speak about these the priorities of the United States, like one party wants to go against Russia and China at the same time, the other one says like we have to prioritize China and Iran. It feels like we're dealing with psychopathic maniacs in Washington D.C. and it's just like the priority, the priority. Our priority is now Russia or China or Iran. It's not like we don't have to go to war against someone. No, you have to choose between this war or these two wars together or these two wars. It's like there's always war in the
choose your
US.
flavor. You can have any
choose your
flavor
flavor
as long as it's war.
Wow, it's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, I was reading this. This is going to be my last question to you. On The Economist, they ask this question. They say, "What happens if Ukraine loses?" Somebody is asking this question nowadays. Yeah, already. And they say a defeat of Ukraine would be a humbling episode for the West, a modern Suez monument. A modern Suez moment, having provided moral, military, and financial aid to its ally for 2 years now, America and Europe have perhaps inadvertently put their own credibility on the line, perhaps, that they have sometimes deterred in delivering this support would make things worse, not better. Further confirmation among skeptics of liberal polities that democracies lack what it takes to stand up for their interests.
Yes.
And then I'm trying to highlight this, but it doesn't work. I don't know why. George Robertson, a former boss of NATO, has warned that, quote, if Ukraine loses, our enemies will decide the world order. Unfortunately for the Taiwanese, among others, he is probably right. So the victory of Russia or the loss of NATO in
what's really interesting about this thinking that Roberts displays here and the Economist also displays through him, it's this idea that one side in the world or one bloc or one power center decides the world order. What they cannot wrap their head around is that if we really enter, and this is what is happening, if we are entering a multipolar world, which is not the first time, this has happened before in history, then world order will emerge from the relationships, the interactions between these different powerful players. It won't be a perfect world. It will still be the case that, unfortunately, the powerful states will get much more shaping power than the less powerful ones. I'm not a utopian. But it's obvious that in a multipolar world, you can have world order. The point is, you have to agree that world order is a common product. It's something that you create together. Now, if the West gets stuck in this toddler posture, where it is now, it's in a 3-year-old. No, actually, I have a 3-year-old. She's much more intelligent and mature. Let's say a 2-year-old toddler posture that the West is in now, which is all or nothing. We decide the world order. We had a unipolar moment and it must last forever. This is what this is. If the West insists on that, there are two possible outcomes, literally two. One is the West will get its Suez moment. This is very fashionable now. Neil Ferguson uses this term as well. They will get the Suez moment and they will lose their power. Or we all end up in a huge global catastrophe together because the West couldn't stop being a toddler and grow the F up finally, right? And become one member of a club of powerful blocs or states. This is what's happening. And the real problem is that the West and the United States in particular simply do not want to accept this reality. They want to resist, I'm sorry to be grandiloquent, history itself. And that never works.
I think.
And by the way, can I say one more thing about Suez?
Of course.
I love that phrase. I've seen it with Ferguson, who had a long article today. I think it was Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg or one other thing where, he's basically a hedge fund consultant, something, film producer who also pretends to be a historian now, right? But anyhow, so he had this long ideological piece where he explains what the West has to do and we can play the paymaster role in Cold War II and all of this stuff. But what I loved about the Suez term is, you know what? For a lot of people in the world, the West getting its Suez in 1956 was a relief. You keep telling people that your Suez moment is coming. A lot of people again in this world will say, yes. Make it happen. No, it's true.
It's what's terrifying is like when I see these two scenarios that you mentioned, and I think about them even when I'm alone, I see that they are going to take the second path, and that is the disaster for the world.
That's right.
So, and when it's a nuclear, I mean, you know what's going to happen, right? If it's nuclear, I mean, when I see people are fear mongering on X and telling them move to the south, go to New Zealand, go to South Africa, I truly think that's probably the only choice you have if there is such a war between Russia and the collective West.
Well, concerning nuclear war, right, which I think is entirely possible. Look, I mean, people who think that for some reason it's magically impossible, why would it be impossible? We have all the structures in place. We have two giant nuclear arsenals, each about 5,000 warheads with the Russians and the Americans. And then we have a lot of smaller arsenals. We have what it needs for a big nuclear war on this planet, right? So it's possible. But what worries me in addition to this is that a lot of people in the West as well, by the way, have invested far too much thinking into the idea of fighting a limited nuclear war. That is, they have this illusion that they can use nuclear weapons and somehow win with them and still be there to win. And all the people who think only Russia ever mentions this possibility, which they do when they want to sort of threaten us into becoming a little more sober, they can read an article published 2018 by a guy called Elbridge Colby. I think it was Foreign Affairs or one of those big magazines in the United States. And what the whole article does is it's making an argument that over Taiwan, the US should be ready for a limited nuclear war, to fight itself a limited nuclear war if necessary to stop the Chinese. That is actually an American expert, and he's quite influential. And this is just one symptom. This whole idea, I'm almost tempted to say this cult or this psychosis of so-called experts in the world who are trying to fantasize that we can have a little bit of nuclear war and that's going to work out well. That makes everything even worse.
So mad. Tarik, this is so mad. And I'm very happy that around 1,000 people watched this insightful conversation today on X, YouTube, Facebook, and Rumble. Guys, thank you so much, really, for watching around 1 hour, and thank you for Tarik for sharing his insightful analysis on this case. I do these conversations because I want to back up these arguments with intelligent people like yourself, and the mission is to open the eyes of as many people possible, because only us, the people, have the power to say no. If you collectively say no, what are they going to do? Like, are they going to force you to go and fight? You have to say no. You have to say no for war. World War III. This scenario is terrifying, and it's unfortunately a possible scenario. So, guys, I hope this conversation was helpful for you. Thank you so much for tuning in, whether you're watching us on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Tomorrow, the live streaming will be 2 hours later. It will be at 7 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time, because Vanessa Billy is coming from Damascus. And you know the electricity situation in Damascus. There is 2 hours electricity and then 4 hours electricity is gone. So she will come when the electricity is there. So I will definitely have her at, as I mentioned, at 7 p.m. Central European Time. I think at 13 in Eastern American Time. So stay tuned and peace be upon you, upon your families. We'll see you tomorrow. Salam.
Bye bye.